should I be chosen to be an usher? I'm Chuck Bass.
Chuck Bass is one of the most psychologically and sociologically dense characters to analyze in the show Gossip Girl. He embodies multiple systems of power and psychopathology all at once. Chuck was the epitome of status congruence and status arrogance, as his economic power was essentially limitless and his social power was huge thanks to the Bass name. So let's dive into who Chuck Bass was and what he represented in the show. Chuck, also known as Charles Bass, was the only son of Bart Bass, a billionaire real estate tycoon and one of the richest men in NYC in the show. Chuck was the poster child for Manhattan's elite and basically had nothing to prove, unlike Dan Humphrey, for instance, who represented status incongruence in the show, or even Nate Archibald, who temporarily represented status disruption and status dislocation at some point in the show. Chuck was truly the depiction of extreme privilege in Gossip Girl, and it was subtly implied that he was even more powerful than all of his peers combined in the Upper East Side. Hence his iconic line often said in the show, "I'm Chuck Bass." Chuck didn't perform power or status in the show. Chuck represented status itself. He embodied legitimacy in his clothing, his aesthetic, his taste, his manners, and his lifestyle. Chuck Bass in the show was the kid who went to school in a limousine, who lived in a 5-star hotel owned by Bass Industries, i.e. by his father. He had private investigators and lawyers on speed dial, he had private jets, and he wore expensive tailored suits and lived without parents, guardians, or rules. And like I said earlier, Chuck represented extreme privilege in the show as he violated norms without social consequence and treated others instrumentally because his class position allowed him moral exemptions, which is a hallmark of extreme privilege. Now let's dive into Chuck's psychology and specifically unpack his daddy issues. Like I mentioned earlier, Chuck was the only son of Bart Bass, and he was very privileged when he was growing up, but he also grew up in very unconventional ways. Chuck was basically left to his own devices in a hotel, surrounded by staff and not by actual parents or guardians. Symbolically, this tells us that Chuck had no emotional grounding as he did not live in a family home. He lived in a commercial luxury space and experienced wealth without containment or real structure from a very young age. So Chuck was basically the archetype of the rich kid who grew up having everything but his parents' love. So his mother wasn't in his life, and although his father was physically present and provided for him, Bart Bass was a hyper-dominant, emotionally absent, and contemptuous father. He was cold, rejecting, punitive, and extremely invalidating. Bart Bass never sought to connect with his son on an emotional level. He also did not see Chuck in high regard, and he was very evaluative. These factors are said to contribute to chronic narcissistic injury through a psychological lens, as Chuck's worth was conditional on performance, power, and usefulness. This means that he has probably internalized from a young age that I am only valuable when I dominate, not when I feel. Now, this brings us to the many psychological perspectives viewers had on Chuck. Many saw Chuck as a narcissist or a sociopath, and although Chuck had many fans, it was incredibly obvious that he was damaged and carried a father wound. Chuck did not grow up having a secure attachment to his father, who was truly his primary and sole attachment figure. And for anyone who is familiar with the attachment theory, we know that cold, rejecting, and invalidating parents usually create insecurely attached children. So it's either the child grows up to become anxiously attached or avoidantly attached or disorganized in their attachment style. In Chuck's case, it is clear that he became avoidantly attached as he has developed a defensive grandiosity that is a hallmark of the avoidant attachment style. Thus, Chuck displayed throughout the show a deep fear of intimacy and vulnerability, hyper-independence, and the use of sex, parties, and drugs to regulate his emotions. In my opinion, the character of Chuck Bass was a textbook depiction of a dismissive avoidant. So how does his psychology correlate with the flaunting and weaponization of his status and wealth? Psychologically speaking, most kids build a self-esteem through consistent and grounding love from caregivers, and they learn emotional regulation through co-regulation by caregivers, empathy, and repair after rupture. Chuck, unfortunately, has only learned that money is his primary emotional regulator. That is why he tends to spiral and escalate things when he is abandoned or powerless, and becomes reckless when he feels emotionally exposed or vulnerable. Chuck's notion of love and attachment is completely flawed, as he has displayed in the earlier seasons predatory and impulsive sexual behaviors, and throughout the show he has also showed deep commitment issues and a deep need for control and power plays in his romantic relationships. So in conclusion, Chuck was extremely privileged, spoiled, and entitled with strong avoidant and narcissistic tendencies, but his romantic relationships and attachments couldn't solely be sustained by money. At some point he had to learn to open his heart up in the show. This brings us to his infamous volatile relationship with Blair Waldorf in the show. Stay tuned for part 2 of the analysis, where I dive into Chuck and Blair's relationship.